Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll make a start. My name's Chris Owen. I'm a partner at Simmons & Simmons, and I head up our business and human rights litigation team. We've got a very interesting discussion scheduled for the next hour and 20 minutes. Hopefully everyone can hear us.
Lo escucho casi.
Just a few pieces of housekeeping before I introduce the session. We are offering this session with interpretation. There is English and Spanish language, and if you look at the bar at the bottom of the Zoom screen, you should be able to see on the right-hand side an option to select English or Spanish, depending on your language. So please do that. In terms of questions, if you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to type in any questions, we will deal with those at the end. And alternatively, if you can't find that box, you can just type into the chat bar that features at the right-hand side of the screen. The seminar is also going to be recorded. So let me start off by introducing everybody and introducing our topic for today. We're here to talk about business and human rights, and in particular, the Human Right Toolbox that Simmons & Simmons have been working together with PBI on for several years now. And I'm joined in the discussion by Susie Bascon. Susie is the Director of Peace Brigades International in the UK, and has had a long career helping human rights defenders around the world in all sorts of manners and against all sorts of challenges. We've also got Victoria Channing, who's from my firm Simmons & Simmons. Victoria is our pro bono manager, and she's also been involved in business and human rights for about a decade, and we have worked together during that time on a number of human rights projects. Victoria has now moved in from fee-earning role to a role heading up our international pro bono team, which operates in 22 different countries. And we're very pleased to be joined by two external guests today. We've got Donald Hernandez, human rights lawyer at the Honduran Center of Community Protection and Development. He's a prominent Honduran human rights lawyer and human rights defender, specializing in criminal and environmental law. We're very pleased to have Donald on the call with us. And then also Alirio Uribe, another eminent human rights lawyer and executive director of CAHA in Colombia. And he has also got very much experience helping human rights defenders in the field, both nationally and internationally. And we're particularly excited to hear about Donald and Alirio's experience, both with the Human Rights Defenders Toolbox and about their work more generally. The aim of today's call really is to look at the toolbox and how it can help human rights defenders in their work, and really what the aim of the toolbox is for is to help on the ground those working in the human rights space to understand what the international principles that might be relevant to the situation is, and then what options there are in terms of one's legal rights, whether that's in terms of legal proceedings, whether that's in terms of more softer engagement with local business, where there is an issue of potential business and human rights breaches by business. And so the fact sheets are designed to give the tools to those working on the ground to be able to understand what their rights are and how those rights might be capable of being implemented in country. So that's the gist of what the toolbox does. It's comprised of 16 different fact sheets covering a number of different topics, and we've designed the toolbox to be as user-friendly as possible, although we always welcome feedback for how it can be improved further. And I'm going to hand over now to Susie Bascon just to give us a little bit more background about today's session, and then on to Victoria, and then finally to Donald and Ilario to expand on their experiences. Susie, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining this webinar, and also for all the work that you, Victoria, Richard Dighton, and also Olga Hancock, who used to be part of the pro bono team, have done to support us with this toolbox. Just to say, in terms of our partnership, we have been working together with Simmons and Simmons for over 3 years, and I don't say that lightly. I mean, it has been quite an intense sort of partnership in that, many lawyers from Simmons and Simmons have been involved in this project. I don't know, maybe 20, 30 lawyers. And the level of commitment of the firm has been huge. I understand it's probably one of the biggest pro bono projects that the firm has ever undertaken. But I think for me, the most important thing is that when we came to speak to Richard Dighton, who is the pro bono partner, with Victoria, with Olga, with Chris, about the issues that we were seeing on the ground, the gaps in the implementation of the UN guiding principles, the violations that we were facing by way of human rights defenders, land rights and environmental defenders being either killed or abused in some of their rights. We came to them in a bit of a desperation and asked, in which way we could perhaps explore the UN guiding principles to sort of look at them from the perspective of human rights defenders. So I know and I appreciate that Simmons has a lot of expertise on the guiding principles, but perhaps more from the perspective of how corporates should be upholding them. But I came to them with a different request. How can we look at the principles from the perspective of human rights defenders? How can they learn about them? How can they understand the best way that they can use them? And of course, they didn't limit themselves to the UN guiding principles. They looked at a vast range of international instruments, and that's something that Victoria would have to tell us a little bit more later. But that's kind of the beauty of this tool, that it doesn't stop in the UN guiding principles. They actually looked at all the potential international instruments that could be invoked by human rights defenders when they are faced and confronted with a violation coming or as a result of sort of corporate abuse or adverse human rights practices by corporations. Also to say that the toolbox, of course, wasn't just the creation of PBI or Simmons and Simmons. I mean, as some of you who have been involved with PBI for some time know, we work very closely with human rights defenders on the ground. We have partnerships with human rights defenders such as Kahar, lawyers like the collective that Alira is part of, and Donald's as well, Hernandez. And so we are in constant communication with them. We monitor their security situation, and we have a good understanding of what are the trends in repressions that they are facing. And this is precisely what we did with Simmons and the Toolbox. We came back to them and said, these are the issues that our defenders are facing, and we want you to understand that, this, for instance, a lack of prior, free and informed consultation is happening within the communities, or, we are observing the use of private corporate companies being used by corporations in order to abuse situations. So we came to them with very specific and concrete situations across particularly the Latin American region. And what Simmons did is they actually listened to their specific request. They understood that the task was to tailor this toolbox to the specific needs of human rights defenders. And that's what I feel they've done extraordinarily well, because it's not always easy to get lawyers to understand what an NGO or what a human rights defender needs. But with Simmons, and because they are very willing to listen and to have a dialogue and a conversation, we were able to understand each other and to come up with this very strong partnership. And therefore, this toolbox was created. I mean, this is obviously not new for Simmons. Simmons has worked with other NGOs. I think they're primarily working with NGOs that are sort of small in size, but they believe that can make a difference. And, we were lucky enough to be sort of accepted as one of their pro bono partners. They are also part of the Alliance for Lawyers at Risk, which is a larger pro bono legal network that PBI founded in 2010 with our late patron, Sir Henry Brooke. And so they have also been participating in those kind of gatherings and meetings, which basically involves advice from the legal community in the UK whenever, needs from the ground arise. So finally, just to say that the toolbox, once it was kind of designed and created, we did a consultation with lawyers in Colombia. Lirio was there with us. Victoria came to the field. We traveled together, and we had the opportunity to meet with a range of 20, 30 human rights defenders to discuss aspects of the fact sheets and to give the Colombian lawyers the opportunity to give us some feedback to see the extent to which this tool was useful or not. The next steps of this toolbox are obviously to ensure that it reached to the people that is most needed. That could be INGO workers, it could be local NGOs, it could be human rights defenders themselves, it could be coalitions, networks. We have invited a huge range of people to this webinar. I don't know exactly how many people are tapping into the webinar right now, but there were around 150 people who subscribed to sort of be part of this webinar. So it has been extremely successful. The level of response much more and above what we were expecting initially. But for us, the most important thing is that defenders ultimately are able to learn the toolbox in more sort of depth, and then use it locally, maybe adapt it if they feel it's required, and then train other defenders in that regard. So yeah, the next steps, just to clarify, would be to create a pool of trainers made of defenders and other kinds of people interested in helping out. And then we will assess a specific thematic area of interest within the toolbox, because it's quite a big tool. And then perhaps we will be able to run 3 more webinars thanks to the generosity of Simon's lawyers. So I think that's what I want to say for the moment. If that's
Thanks, Susie. And I probably should have said that the toolbox has also been translated into Spanish, so that it actually is of more use to people in those communities where Spanish is the language they speak. And obviously the toolbox is in English, and potentially it can be rolled out into further languages in due course. And as you say, Susie, the idea is that we will be hosting some specific webinars on some of the legal issues that feature in the toolbox, to try and explore those in a little bit more detail, and to also hear potentially some experiences of how those issues play out on the ground. And the next person I'd like to invite to speak is Victoria Channing, who I've introduced already, but Victoria is going to give us just a little bit more detail about some of the content of the toolbox and her experiences when she was over in Colombia launching it. Victoria.
Thank you, Chris. As Susie has been saying, the focus of this project has been very much on the needs of human rights defenders. And my involvement with human rights defenders, and particularly in Colombia, started quite a long time ago now, where I went to Colombia with an organization called the Colombian Caravana, which is an international network of jurists that support human rights lawyers in that area. And as part of that trip, I interviewed a number of different human rights defenders in the Santa Marta region, as well as victims of human rights abuses in that region, and put together a draft report which was then presented to a number of different government authorities at that time. And that gave me a really good base understanding of the issues that lawyers and other defenders were facing on the ground, which you don't necessarily appreciate sitting in an office in the UK. And taking that knowledge and that experience, we were working with Susie and her team to start thinking about what topics might be of use to those who were battling with these issues on a day-to-day basis. So we drafted a number of fact sheets, 16 in total. And then later in 2018, I returned to Colombia, this time with Peace Brigades International and other large NGOs. And the purpose of that was to consult with the Colombian lawyers on the ground about whether they found this helpful, what topics they would like to see developed, and we also hosted a training session in Bogota for those interested in taking this project forward. So in summary, the toolbox is mainly focused on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which of course is not a binding legal instrument, but is gathering in importance and is certainly being actively considered by large companies and corporates when starting new projects in predominantly developing countries, but also in their own jurisdictions. But we have also branched out to cover a number of additional topics following our consultation, which includes defamation, environmental hazards, free, prior, informed consent, operating in conflict-affected areas, private military and security companies, internal displacement, mass tort claims, which I have to say is a specialist subject of Chris, that forms part of his everyday legal practice, and also a review of certain national action plans, so that we got a good understanding of what the government in relevant jurisdictions were doing in relation to business and human rights. So that's just a high-level idea of what is included in this resource. But even having drafted a set of short fact sheets and trying to condense all of this knowledge into something that was easily digestible by those who are not necessarily familiar with the legal structure, we found that human rights defenders were still often finding it difficult to navigate through these legal instruments and to understand how they could be practically applied on the ground in their day-to-day work. So we added a further resource to our toolbox, where we drafted a short fictitious case study, and that demonstrates how human rights defenders might use and navigate the toolbox. So that case study looks at the brief facts of a fictitious case. So in this situation, it was a collective looking to address contamination from a local copper mine, which affected the health of the local community and their crops. We then looked at the key legal issues for consideration, and then gave a bit of advice as to practical next steps that a human rights defender in this fictitious scenario might consider taking. So as part of that practical application, we looked at free, prior, informed consent, human rights due diligence, and the use of leverage, and also grievance mechanisms and remediation. So I would encourage those on the call who are interested that they consult that case study, as it could be used as a template to maybe train or raise awareness of these issues within their own jurisdictions. So Donald and Illyria have already looked at this toolbox and are here to give a bit of an overview of how they are applying it in their jurisdictions. But before I pass over to them, I just wanted to flag a couple of points just to understand about this resource. So firstly, it's designed to be of global application. So that means that we have not included local laws within that toolbox, and that's very much something for local lawyers to advise on. Likewise, it is guidance only, and a resource like this could never ever replace getting detailed local legal advice. And we're also in the process of updating our human rights defenders toolbox. So the resource that we have online will be redrafted with the assistance of Simmons lawyers, some of whom are actually listening to this call. So with that in mind, I'd be delighted to hear a little bit more from our colleagues in Honduras and Colombia as to how they have found this resource in practice.
And just, if I can just, before I introduce them, just to give a word on the updates, and that's because the area of business and human rights, as those who are involved in it will know, is a very fast-paced developing area with lots of changes all the time, both in terms of cases that are being heard in different jurisdictions around the world, but also in terms of legal rights. So, for example, we've just had the UK National Action Plan. We've had an update from that last month. And obviously there are lots of developments that are going to potentially happen in the future. So as people will know, there's talk about a binding treaty. I have to say I don't think that will be here anytime soon, but it's certainly an area that's generating quite a lot of discussion between states about what might be in a binding treaty. And even if the treaty itself doesn't come in, that in turn can nevertheless have an effect in terms of how corporates are viewing their current operations and what steps they may or may not be taking, which has a direct bearing in country and obviously on the work of human rights defenders. So now I'm really excited for this part of the discussion because we can actually hear from human rights defenders who are actually using the toolbox in practice. So a reminder that hopefully you've done so already, but if not, you need to select your translation channel. defenders will be talking to us in Spanish, and so you need to select English if you want to hear the translation of that into English, and vice versa. And so first, I think Donald will go first. Donald, coming from Honduras, we look really forward to hearing about your experience on the ground. Donald.
I mean that when this toolbox was enabled for us, it came to us in Honduras at the right time, because the Honduran state has had a very bad record regarding the relationship between the state, private companies, and civil society. In other words, there has been a poor approach to the development of projects in territories where the rights of populations have been systematically violated, and as a result, we have had confrontation, criminalization, threats, and even murders, a lot of murders. The most famous was that of our friend Berta Cáceres, but we are currently seeing many more people murdered and others imprisoned, precisely because of both the private companies and the state's approach on projects. Here, the Honduran state is bound internationally, and in our particular case, by the Universal Periodic Review that Honduras submits to the UN. Our government is required to begin by adhering to the establishment of a national action plan that includes this issue of the guiding principles. This would partly respond to this major conflict that we have in Honduras, but they began to talk about national action plans and nobody understood them, neither the state nor private companies as such. Private companies have misunderstood the concept of guiding principles with corporate social responsibility as gifts given to communities. When we use the toolbox, we find a source of information that for 2 years has allowed us, as a civil and social organization, to familiarize ourselves with the topic and to start looking for relationships between different parties and ourselves as civil society. It has allowed us to monitor the application of the guiding principles with the state itself, already clearly understanding that there are responsibilities of the state, responsibilities of private companies, and supervision that civil society organizations can provide in this matter. It helped me a lot that the first thing I found in this toolbox was an example of the National Action Plan of a European country. I think Finland is the one in there, and that's what I'm going to study, so I can keep asking questions. We were already familiar with the experience of the route that Mexico is taking on the same topic, Guatemala as well, and from then on we started to follow up to speak to the Human Rights Secretary in Honduras, because we saw that with the goal of establishing a national action plan, the case was not being taken seriously. So in Honduras, we coordinated a larger space, an articulation space that brought together 30 organizations throughout the whole country to develop territorial defense actions, mainly in indigenous communities. And so, in the same toolbox, we are also steadily finding the most basic elements to familiarize ourselves with the topic, at a time and place where we found that we could not expect to establish a dialogue with the state and private companies if we showed even a slight understanding. And if 2 years ago our knowledge was very limited, the knowledge that the executives of the state and private companies had was zero. They were confusing the concepts, and to that extent we took time using the toolbox and we developed a diploma. Here the audio is interrupted, and then Donald comes back saying, "Thank you. I was saying that as a result of this, we made the decision to develop a more intensive course on the topic of guiding principles. And as a source, we used a lot of information that we had already found in the toolbox. It was interesting, nearly 6 months of training 30 leaders from different parts of the country to familiarize them with the role of the state, the role of companies, and the role of civil society in this tripartite space. This also helped us a lot in pursuing talks with the state institutions to demand that they stopped rushing to fulfill requirements only as a checklist in this delicate issue. To that extent, we believe that we have made a positive impact in bringing about the current commitment made by the representatives of the Secretariat for Human Rights to develop a national action plan in Honduras. That is not only fulfillment of goals, but also a topic adequately discussed with the different parties involved. We have also held talks with different people, some from private companies who have sent us their current human rights policy based on what they have understood about the guiding principles. And today, as civil society, we can question them and begin to discuss these policies. and assess these policies. In the meantime, it is also important to say that when we found the toolbox, the case that is presented in the toolbox is a very real case of what we experience daily, at least in Honduras. We are permanently in conflict with the state and private companies, who for us are the same. As lawyers, we are permanently in the courts defending our leaders, precisely because of their position in the defense and their demands. Because now men and women, at least our leaders, are already empowered with knowledge of the guiding principles. Now, based on these standards, they demand respect. For example, respect for the right to consultation in indigenous communities, and the requirement for private companies to adhere to international standards. Of course, private entrepreneurs don't like this because they have not wanted to bend to respect the rights of communities, or be forced to repair the environmental damage they have caused. But ultimately, I want to close this first space by saying, for us, the most useful thing in the toolbox has been that the documents are practical, easy to understand, and very effective. They are a great source because they help communities apply and understand the things we are achieving in this slow and systematic process that we have been building here in Honduras, at least over the last 2 years. I'll stop there so I don't take up too much time.
Buenas tardes para...
Well, good afternoon to all of you. A very special thanks to Simmons & Simmons with Victoria and with Chris. Thanks to Susie and PBI UK, to Donald from Honduras, to James the interpreter. Likewise, I would like to thank all the people who I can see on the panel and the many organisations from London who have always supported human rights work in Colombia. I would therefore like to point out that for a country like Colombia, where we have had an armed conflict for more than 50 years and several peace processes, the conflict continues and we still see the presence of many national companies but also multinational companies. We especially see mining companies, extractive companies, hydroelectric companies, really all kinds of companies. This instrument that has been provided by PBI and Simmons & Simmons as a way of documenting cases of serious human rights violations in Colombia more effectively has allowed organizations like ours to work with rural communities, indigenous communities, with Afro communities who are all impacted in many parts of the country where the armed conflict occurs. In these areas, the state, the police, the army all have a strong presence, but there are also paramilitary groups and guerrillas, some of whom have already disarmed and others who have rearmed and are now the successors to paramilitarism. This means that companies have operated in conflict areas and that in some way they have not respected domestic or international law or due diligence when operating in Colombia. This has led us to use the suggested standards to document cases, as we have been able to present reports such as one that we recently presented to the Truth Commission, Comisión de la Verdad, where we revealed the responsibility of companies regarding human rights and the armed conflict. These instruments can also document behavioral patterns of businesses that help contribute to the truth about the participation of companies in the armed conflict, the dispossession of land in violation of environmental and community rights, and the deprivation of many communities' livelihoods as a result of the intervention of companies in their lands. These instruments help us read these patterns and show how the truth comes out when communities document the presence of certain companies on their land. They also help to achieve or look for litigation strategy, let's say strategy to reveal responsibility and to demand the criminal liability of companies. We have identified how, for example, in terms of security, companies have violated the Ruggie principles, but also the United Nations principles regarding business behavior. We have identified more than 1,500 agreements between the companies and the Ministry of Defense, battalions, and the privatization of the army. Somehow, they have managed to align the security forces with business interests and not with the defense of sovereignty or with the defense of community life. And this is why they have ended up financing not only the army, the police and the public prosecution, which investigates many social leaders, but also paramilitary groups. We have identified companies like La Chiquita Brands that imported weapons, rifles through their company's ports to paramilitary groups. We have also noticed how companies like BP contributed to the militarization of the country, to paying for paramilitary groups. Drummond has also contributed to the financing of paramilitary groups, but also to the murder of trade unionists. With paramilitaries and security forces, Drummond's security company assassinated social leaders, and they were involved with anti-union practices, repressive practices towards peasant or indigenous communities, and land dispossession, which in Colombia has a victims law and a land restitution law. With these instruments, we can bring to light how the companies robbed farmers and indigenous people of millions of hectares, and how, through this violent dispossession of land, communities were also attacked, or how water has been appropriated through environmental damage. And paradoxically, Colombia and Colombian companies have internationally positioned themselves as having some of the best corporate social responsibility programs. We have been able to document how in Colombia, corporate social responsibility is used as PR by companies that are engaged in serious human rights violations. We have also documented how social responsibility is used in the era of, for example, COVID, as a kind of political marketing and not really to defend human rights. In fact, many of the companies who lead the discourse on companies and human rights with voluntary standards in Colombia are the companies that have been most involved in serious human rights violations. Therefore, I believe that these instruments, which, as Victoria said, you are currently updating, there is a need to further train the organizations and communities that live in the zones that are faced with mega projects, oil, coal, hydroelectric constructions, and agro-industrial projects, so that they can document their cases in order to take national and international action, to defend their rights as communities, to defend their land, to defend their livelihoods and their life plans. These instruments are what indigenous peoples and what communities have to defend their rural economies against these transnational megaprojects. These communities are victims, not only of armed groups, but they are also victims of development, of what we call development, that is, of megaprojects that do not recognize their rights in their own lands. Therefore, we want to acknowledge the contribution you have made from England with these instruments. We want to emphasize the need to disseminate them so that we, for example, in the schools that we run as a lawyers collective, or with the community leaders that fight against multinationals or mega projects, can better learn from this experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to Donald and to Illyrio for sharing their thoughts. It's very humbling to hear the real life experiences and to have heard about the toolkit at least offering some help in those difficult situations in your respective jurisdictions. And thank you very much for sharing your experiences on this call today. We have set aside some time for questions. So some questions have come in. We've got 60 people on the line, and some questions have come in, and I will shout those questions out in a second. But for others of you who have questions, please do type them into the Q&A box now, and we'll do our best to put those to the speakers and to get answers for you. And if we can't get answers now, then we can follow up afterwards. So please, the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, if you click in that and type your question in either English or Spanish. Now, the questions that have come in, the first one's an easy one that I can deal with. It's where do I find the toolbox? So the toolbox is available online. If you search for Human Rights Toolbox and then PBI or Simmons and Simmons afterwards, it will come up. It's available either on the PBI website or on the Simmons and Simmons website. And you can see that within this screen that comes up, there's a link to each of the fact sheets. And also to the case study that Victoria was mentioning. And Adam's just circulating now a link on the screen for the link to the toolbox. Couple of other questions.
Just to add to that, Chris.
Yes. Yes, Susie. Go ahead.
No, just to say that in addition to the fact sheets on the Simmons and Simmons website, you can also find a series of videos that have been recorded with specific information on some of the fact sheets, in case you want to have a brief sort of outline of what they are about.
That's right, yes. And they give you a bit more information on the specific topics. So in some ways, they're a sort of prelude to the 3 webinars that we're planning to run over the next couple of months. Then a couple of the questions that people have asked. First, I think people have found it very interesting to hear that the fact sheets, the Toolbox, have been capable of being to help with interpretation when dealing with either local government or dealing with corporates in country. A question has been asked, and I think it's a good question. I'm interested in it as well. Is have the entities with whom those discussions taken place, have they accepted the points that have been put forward from the Toolbox, or have they not? It would be good to hear how that has gone on the ground, and maybe Donald and Illyria can give us their thoughts on whether there has been an acceptance of the principles once they have been put to stakeholders. Who wants to go first on that, Donald or Illyria? Can I invite either of you to give your thoughts?
I'm going to have a go at this one. The connection is patchy, but I understood that the question was, how have the authorities accepted these measures? Well, I want to say that for us in Honduras, it is still too new a topic in the relationships we have had with state officials. They have been notified about the processes we have developed with members of civil society in the communities on this issue. For the Human Rights Minister and her team, it has been a surprise to find out that social leaders have been concerned about this issue for 1.5 years, and that they are ahead of her own team in terms of their knowledge and empowerment on the topic. In the same way, they are a little more advanced than private company officials who, as I keep saying, continue to confuse the issue of corporate social responsibility with the issue of human rights principles. So they have acknowledged the topic, that we are waiting for them, because the difference here is that nowadays, when the company tries to violate the community's rights, we already find empowered leaders who demand accountability. And in light of this process, there are 2 options. Either one acts in ignorance of these obligations, or one acts violently, attacking, without acknowledging rights, or without understanding the need to sit down and understand these new processes. So we are still there institutionally, developing forums in a tripartite way to let officials know that they have to take these institutional commitments more seriously. And we also let employers know that our leaders are now empowered and familiar with the obligations, and that they will not be allowed to continue to violate their rights. So we are in a more political moment, and there is building pressure in the Chamber of Deputies, in the necessary requests, and with the organizations, that we don't have a flimsy document regarding Honduras and its responsibility in light of its obligations in the UN, but rather that we have a dynamic that allows us to lower the levels of confrontation in order to understand and respect rights. As a country, we are very backward on this matter, so I can't exactly say whether private companies or the state are accepting these developments, because it's an issue that they hadn't been sufficiently absorbing until today. I feel that civil society, our organizations, continue to keep making steps forward, and now we need the state with all its institutions to familiarize itself with these issues. We have judges and prosecutors who do not want to know about this issue, who do not want to understand what the state's responsibility in lawsuits is, or that there are international norms being violated, but rather they only want to adhere to the limited internal law that we currently have as a country. And this is one of the great battles we have out on the streets as a civil society, demanding for laws to be amended. We are currently in a great battle against a new penal code that Congress has already approved, but that they have not yet put into action. Highly corrupt officials are being freed from their responsibilities by a penal code that criminalizes public protest and by something that classifies it as terrorism. And it is an issue that greatly worries us, as it will only lead to greater conflict in the country. So to that extent, what our political class does not understand could be less confrontational if we all had a culture of respecting rights. And that is the issue to which we are referring. The origin of serious human rights violations is the lack of interest in the balancing of powers. We cannot, as civil society, nor with the leaders, go further than those who are responsible for being the spokespeople for this issue, which is caused by state institutions. We cannot go further on the issue of familiarization, which we have to convince private companies to do, because the private companies are very selfish and they don't understand that their business is better when they respect rights. At least in Honduras, in this case, I think as we continue talking about these issues and empowering our people, we compel judges, prosecutors, we compel all the state institutions to become more involved in these processes, which, as I say, for us in Honduras are still new. Thank you. Well, continuing with what Donald has raised, in the case of Colombia, I can see 3 questions in the chat that Donald has already answered. Another about whether or not we can be optimistic about the future, and another from Peter on how to deal with the issue of the principles. This toolbox, and how to ensure that companies hold themselves accountable regarding these issues. I would say the following, that here in the Colombian context, one could say that Colombia is advanced in terms of the discussions, especially in the United Nations principles, the Ruggie principles, and the issue of corporate responsibility. The concern is that here the companies facing the special jurisdiction of peace, HEP, and the Truth Commission want to present themselves as victims and not accomplices, or as not being complicit in serious human rights violations. The companies do not want to accept that they benefited financially because they did business by generating conflict and making the security forces align with the interests of companies and not with the rights of communities. This translated into repression, violence, protests, the criminalization of communities, and also, in many cases, the assassination of environmentalists or social leaders. So let's say that today companies in Colombia want to present themselves as victims. That is to say that they operated in areas where there was violence and that they were attacked or kidnapped, and they don't want to take responsibility for the conflict. Obviously, we would like the situation to improve in the future, but in the case of Colombia, the situation improves depending on whether or not the peace agreements are implemented, on comprehensive rural reform, on drug policies, on complying with the special justice and peace system, on complying with the Truth Commission. But companies want to go under the table. They don't want to take responsibility for what they have been doing all these years in the conflict, or for what they continue to do when they carry out their business operations using the land of displaced people, of people who were massacred, of people who were violently expropriated. They believe they own the land in good faith, that they bought it and that they did not know what had happened in those areas before. So, the voluntary standards discourse, well, obviously, they have used it to say that they are going to respond through corporate social responsibility in order to have better practices or to have due diligence. But in reality, many of the companies who adopted this discourse were those who had worked closely with the army and the police, the sectors who violated these human rights most and even financed paramilitary groups. I can make a list of companies like Chiquita Brands, like Coca-Cola, like BP, like Drummond, like Occidental, Ecopetrol, Nestle, Cerrejón, Postobón, etc. Business groups like Rio Paila, companies like Argos, Poligro, Pacific, Front Energy. In Colombia, many of these companies are accused of being complicit in serious human rights violations. So for us, one way that this could improve in the future is by making these issues judicially visible, by making them visible in the Truth Commission, and somehow by creating a plan for non-repetition so that this situation is resolved. We need to make companies comply with international standards and guidelines so that human rights are respected. This is why it seems to me that these challenges are still alive, that it's important to implement this mechanism, to implement these tools to document more cases in a much more technical way, and that they may be more enforceable and be brought to trial as well, or to the parent companies where the crimes were committed. So, environmental damage, everything that has happened regarding these issues, damage to communities, must be documented, and improvements must be made to that documentation. If the companies don't accept that these practices occurred, that they didn't foresee, that they didn't evaluate what it meant to rely upon the army, or even have military bases in the headquarters of the oil companies, or deploy tanks at the coal mines, like in La Guajira with Cerrejón, where the company port had tanks and the army taking care of the area, which led to abuses against the communities. If they ignore and don't consider the fact that the measures they took to protect their businesses ended up affecting civilians, it will be difficult to change this in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that. Very, very helpful to get your thoughts. Another couple of questions that are quite challenging ones. Just before I move on to this, it's been pointed out that a couple of the links to the Spanish, some of the Spanish fact sheets may not be working properly. We'll make sure that after this discussion that's sorted out so that all the links work and that everybody can access all of the fact sheets. So apologies for that. Now, some of the more difficult questions that have been put, this next one says, how do we address the challenge that at the same time as the UNGPs represent an opportunity to defend rights, as the toolbox itself reflects? It can also be used as a strategy by companies to shield themselves from international legal responsibilities, with language such as impacts and obligations to mitigate, etc. It's a good question. That would Susie or Victoria or like to give their initial response to that issue?
I can say something if you want, and then perhaps you, Victoria. I mean, when we started working with Siemens on this project, the very one thing that we didn't want to do is to produce a toolbox that was aimed to legitimize the UN Guiding Principles, because we knew for a fact that many human rights defenders on the ground and communities were actually against the UN Guiding Principles, because many of them see them as an opportunity to to help companies to sort of shield themselves behind those wonderful principles that in theory are there, in practice are not applied. So we are aware that this is something that is occurring, that there are gaps in the implementation, but we also sort of believe that it is important for human rights defenders and communities to understand the language of the corporate world and the language of state, and because corporations and states are talking about the UN Guiding Principles as a framework and are using that framework to sort of negotiate and to sort of engage in discussions with civil society. So there is for us an aim, which is to ensure that communities and human rights defenders understand the language, understand the framework, not to legitimate it, precisely the opposite, to identify where the gaps are precisely in the implementation, and to find the roots and the ways in which those gaps can be exposed, documented, as Alirio was saying, and possibly being taken in front of the right stakeholders. I think Siemens have done a good job in that as I said, they didn't just focus on the UN Guiding Principles. They looked at a wider range of international instruments, and basically what defenders can do is to look for that range of sort of jurisprudence or international sort of frameworks available, and then see the extent to which they can invoke some of those instruments whenever it's relevant for whatever conversations they might need to have, whether it's corporations, whether it's states, and so on. So yeah, my view is that this is just a tool. I think the UN Guiding Principles can be misused, and I think we all have a duty, whether it's a corporation like Siemens, whether it's human rights defenders, whether it's NGOs as ourselves, to continue upholding those instruments and exposing the gaps in the implementation. Yeah, that would be my view on that.
Thank you, Susie. Victoria, do you have anything to add to that? You're on mute, Victoria. Vic, if you hover over the screen at the top right, you should be able to see an unmute button.
I've got you. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Apologies. I would say that I understand, having had this conversation quite a lot with human rights defenders, that many people who are dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis, and also those working with NGOs, do not think that the UN guiding principles go far enough. They think that this is actually quite a soft way of trying to encourage powerful companies to take on policies that perhaps don't suit them economically. There is a merit to those arguments. However, I would say that it is incredibly difficult to come to any sort of binding instrument, or to agree on any binding instrument in relation to business and human rights internationally. And at an international level, many of you will be aware that attempts have been made and are being made to conclude and negotiate and draft a binding treaty on human rights, and which I believe we will come to that in the future, particularly if companies ignore the provisions of the UN guiding principles and refuse to implement them on a voluntary basis. And I know that Chris, in his practice area, has been looking at this and has been following developments quite closely when he's been advising his clients. Chris, do you have anything perhaps to add to that?
Well, I was actually going to highlight another challenge that my corporate clients tell me when looking at the UNGPs, and that is that those who are perhaps you might say more forward thinking in terms of wanting to do the right thing face the difficulty that when they if they go and conduct human rights due diligence, or if they go and put out a human rights policy about the sort of things that they wish to do in respect of the local community, then sometimes those policies can be seized on and used in order to commence litigation against the company if it has either uncovered something that's relatively negative, or if it is said it is going to remediate some issue, for example, and then that remediation has slowed or not happened. And that's a difficult issue, because obviously it's right that pressure be put on corporates to do the right thing in the community, but that has to be balanced against the slight challenge which is that some corporates say, well, look, aren't we better just effectively staying below the parapet and not engaging with the UNGPs? Now, my own view is that that's actually risky, and that by taking that approach, not only is that the wrong thing to do from a moral perspective, but actually in the fullness of time, one can actually find that more difficulties present. But it is definitely a discussion that happens at the board level about whether not to try and be a good company and engage or not. And no doubt different people have different views on that, and Donald and Illyrio will no doubt have very significant experience on the ground about their interactions with companies, and so I'd welcome their comments on this difficulty about engagement as well. But perhaps, Victoria, just back to you before I hand over to Donald and Illyrio for their thoughts on this issue. Anything you want to add more, Victoria? You're on mute still. We still can't hear you, Victoria, so maybe I'll go to Donald and Illyrio. Do either of you want to comment on the challenges of interaction with companies trying to uphold the UNGPs, but maybe having difficulties doing so? Is there anything you want to share from your own experiences beyond that which you've already shared with us?
Well, I agree with Victoria that it is difficult to have a binding treaty before the United Nations in order to achieve a more effective tool that covers the responsibility companies must take on in international settings, but also in their own countries, in parent countries, or in third countries where they carry out their activities. In the case of Colombia, we also have a problem because the criminal legislation does not encompass the criminal liability of companies, but it is only individuals who answer for very serious crimes. And although some of the company's legal representatives could respond individually, since there is no corporate criminal liability, we have had legislative initiatives stuck in Congress for several years. Currently, there is one pending to see if this responsibility can be regulated. We believe that, as Susie told us, the Ruggie principles are therefore an important guide to assess the responsibility of companies. But obviously, when we document cases, the idea is to hopefully take them to judicial authorities through constitutional actions or liability actions, civil or extra-contractual, and hopefully, in some cases, criminal responsibility. But it is not easy to do so, and it is not easy for communities to access the judicial authorities either. Evidence standards are very difficult because companies have a huge economic capacity to buy opinions or expert reports to present what they do as done legally or impartially, and we know that in many cases there is a large corporate takeover of the state. About 3 months ago, I was in La Guajira, where there is a stream that was diverted and the communities lost their water and the area is now a desert. There were 17 state institutions, among them the Ministry of Environment, the Environment Minister, with all 17 state entities defending the company and against the indigenous Wayuu communities. In other words, the state detaches itself and it is taken over from within the institutions themselves. In fact, the Environment Minister who was at the meeting was an ad hoc minister, because the main minister had been an advisor to the company involved. So, in other words, one of the issues that we also have to work on is the corporate takeover of the state. Here, when President Duque came to office, this government appointed the ministers and 10 of them came from the economic associations. Then, when they come to public office, they come to defend the interests of the companies and not to defend the interests of the communities. That is to say that this corporate takeover buys the will of public officials and of the controlling bodies, and positions as public interest what is really the economic interests of the business sector.
Chris, can I add something briefly?
Susie, do you wish to make a comment?
Yes. I just want to say that. I find, I've been involved with PBI for 20-some years, and I find extremely useful and rewarding to be able to engage with partners such as Simmons & Simmons, because although they corporate body, it's an institution that we have been able to have conversations with, we have been able to have dialogue with. It has helped us to expand our knowledge and understanding of the UN guiding principles and all the challenges behind that. But beyond that, we've acted as a bridge between human rights defenders and the legal bodies. So I think that corporations such as Simmons have an important role to play as well, sort of help other legal bodies to understand the importance of some of these issues. And I appreciate that the solution, it doesn't just lie in one firm, trying to act in the right way. But I do have a lot of faith in more firms such as Simmons, having a keen interest, a genuine interest in sort of observing human rights standards and ensuring that others do within the sector. And I value that and I appreciate that. And to me, that's one of the treasures of working with Simmons & Simmons on this project. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, one observation from my own sort of practice area is that whilst obviously there is a hope that corporates of their own volition step up to the plate and adhere to the UN guiding principles, in some occasions that doesn't happen. But what we are starting to see increasingly is that the threat of litigation, often in a foreign country, may itself operate as a degree of a stick in order to drive better practices. Now, that may not be perfectly ideal, but from a human rights defender's perspective, I suspect that anything is better than nothing. And so if that is the stick that is needed, well, at least it is better than nothing. And so what I'm really meaning is the fact that we are seeing claims brought particularly against parent companies for the actions of their subsidiaries overseas. And those claims against the parent companies are being brought in a number of jurisdictions, which include America, England, Canada, Australia, etc. And I think that focused with the risk of global litigation, that is starting, at least from what I've seen, to have some impact, only the start, but some impact on how corporates behave in jurisdictions around the world. And I see there's a question here which says, can you say there is a fiduciary duty of directors on companies to address environmental and human rights issues? That's obviously a question for each relevant national law, as well as international law. But broadly, I think we're seeing in some jurisdictions, including England, that there is an increasing acceptance from the judiciary to try and find corporate liability, perhaps not at the point of director liability, but corporate liability in some sense on the actions of corporates abroad. And I think there's only one direction of travel in that area, and I think that direction of travel is to see increased liability risks for corporates and potentially in the future directors as well. And so I think that will drive some better behaviours as time goes on. And one of the broader questions we've been asked in this call is there any hope for the United Nations Guiding Principles and for human rights defenders more generally based on the capitalist society that we live in? And I would hope that I can answer that whilst there are difficulties all over the world that we're all aware of, that I see there's some hope for a better future. And if anything comes out of COVID-19, perhaps it can be a springboard for better environmental, social, governance standards from corporates across the world, and let's hope that we see at least some movement in that direction.
Can I just add there, Chris, because I hear what you're saying, and what I was going to say before, and I couldn't figure out how to take myself off of mute, was that I think there is an educational piece to be done with the UN Guiding Principles, and we've gone some way doing that, particularly in England. And we are seeing some movement by some of the large extractive companies who are genuinely embracing some of these principles and are seeing it as a corporate and commercial opportunity, because they realise that some of their consumers, an increasing number of their consumers post-COVID-19, are looking to engage with organisations who genuinely care about the world around them and are investing in green and healthy companies, and those who take their human rights obligations seriously. So I think that I would share the optimism of Chris in that it may take a while, but actually I think that the capitalist society will ultimately and hopefully drive profits towards companies making better decisions when it comes to protecting human rights. Now, of course, each jurisdiction is in a different stage of that journey, and our role as lawyers and as human rights defenders is to push companies in the right direction and make sure that they understand that where they are not adhering to these principles voluntarily, there will be ultimately down the line increasing amount of mandatory rules, regulations and laws that will compel them to adhere to those rules. So cautious optimism, I think, on my part.
Thank you. No, I agree with that. It's a slow journey, but hopefully one going in the right direction. Well, I'm conscious of time. We've had lots of food for thought and lots of interesting pieces of information, stories and experiences shared with us, which is very, very helpful to hear about that and to hear about how the toolbox has been implemented. We would be very interested in feedback on the toolbox, how it can be improved, what could be done to make it better, There have been a few suggestions that have come through already, which include whether it could be rolled out in other jurisdictions. That's something we'll take away, and also whether further case studies could be developed. We'll also take that away. Thank you very much for those suggestions. If people after this seminar have any other reflection on how to improve the toolkit, please do contact Susie or one of us and let us know, because that is very valuable as we take it forward. The aim of this is for it to be useful, and who better to tell us that than the people who are using it. So we're grateful for that. And then finally from me, just to flag that hopefully with this session has given us a useful overview of what the toolkit is, what it does. As I said, we're going to dig in to some of the topics in more details on the follow-up webinars. One of the points that Susie mentioned at the start was about trainers. We're very interested for hearing from anybody who, having heard this, would like to volunteer to be a trainer and to help to roll out the toolkit and the messaging that comes from it. So I think maybe before I conclude, Susie, is there anything else you'd like to flag at the end of this discussion before I say the thank yous?
Yeah, no, just to say thank you to everyone. I think there are lots of really passionate and committed people in the audience, some of our donors, but also, you know, human rights defenders and INGOs. And this is just to say that this can only be a collective effort. I mean, Simmons have done a really good job in terms of laying out, you know, the international instruments in a way that they can be usable, but it's now down to each of us to make use of those sort of tools. So anyone who might feel inclined, you know, to sort of help to disseminate in whatever way, I mean, we are really, really interested in hearing about you. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, it just remains for me to thank firstly to our guest, Donald and Luria. Thank you so much for coming on and for sharing your experiences. It's really great to hear from human rights defenders from your country. Thank you. And to Susie and Victoria, thank you very much. And also to our translators, thank you for that. I know it's very challenging to do a live translation on a Zoom call, so we really appreciate that. I think that's gone well. Thank you. And also to the other hosts for setting this up and helping to facilitate. So we look forward to the webinars. Details of those will follow. And to everybody who joined us, thank you very much. And thank you also to your questions. I wish everybody a very nice rest of their evening. Thanks a lot, and goodbye from us. Goodbye.
Gracias. Chao.
Ciao. Bye-bye.